All right, hello everybody and welcome to the final seminar for the CPGS for semester 1, 2021. And we're very pleased this afternoon to welcome Tally Palmer from the Institute for Water Research at Rhodes University, who's going to be talking to us about the nature of knowledge. And just a reminder that we will be keeping an eye on the chat, so please do post your questions and comments in the chat as we go. And we are recording this session and it will be available afterwards as per usual on our YouTube channel. So if for whatever reason your call drops or you get kicked out of the room, please try to come back into the room. But if you're unable to, you will be able to catch up on the recording, and you'll also be able to obviously tell friends and colleagues about this if you think that they need to also have a listen and think about some of these issues. So welcome, Tally, and welcome everybody. And over to you.
Hi, oh, excuse me. Hi, everyone. As Sharon kindly said, I'm Tally Palmer. I work at the Institute for Water Research, and the Institute is home to the African Research Universities Alliance Water Centre of Excellence. So we are now very well connected to 9 universities all across Africa, which is a very exciting thing that's happened in the last few years. Well, can you imagine being asked if you would like to talk about what is knowledge? It's a little bit like life, the universe, and everything. So I hope you'll understand that I'm going to share some ideas. I'm going to hope to provoke you into thinking about this, and then give you some flavor of the way in which we are taking the ideas that I'll share with you into the practice of research and academic enterprise. So here we go. Maybe if it will go down for me. So I'm struggling. Oh, there we go. Just starting with my piece of knowledge that grounds me. And this is a slide that I promised to show as my first slide in all my presentations, because it says an enormous amount about who I am, what I do, and one of the values of being deeply connected with humanity. So the slide's about we all live, sorry, let me try and just have a look there, sorry. We all live on this planet in a catchment. Now, what is a catchment? Catchment is a piece of ground on which rain falls, or snow, or dew, or whatever sort of water falls. And if there wasn't water there in some form or other, there wouldn't be people, because people need water. And so the space of human living is landscapes with water. And those landscapes carry everything that we know, whether it's cities or agricultural contexts, or the ocean side, or wilderness places, or deep inside cities. So this notion of living on a planet, on this planet in a catchment, is one of the things, one of the identities that we share with every other human being. And I find that both comforting and challenging. So here are some of the ideas that I'd like you to think about. I'm sorry for, oh, there we go. Right. These are some of the questions that Sharon shared with me. What knowledge do you create? What knowledge are you in the business of growing? What does it mean to make a contribution to knowledge? Whose knowledge is valued and why? How do we speak back to things like fake news and outright lies that are dressed up as knowledge? What about the knowledge that is generated with and by participants in your studies? I'm struggling with my bits of the screen this afternoon, sorry. Who gets to make knowledge? Now, these are all quite challenging questions. And what I'd like us to do this afternoon is to try and expand our ideas. whatever you came into this webinar thinking about knowledge, let's see if we can grow that thinking a bit wider, and in growing it, share with each other what we think and what we know. So I'm going to ask you some questions. What kind of knowledge do you trust? What is the place where you feel most at home in trusting the way you know? And if we go to a sense of, one of the ideas is this triangle of human consciousness, where your consciousness encompasses what you think, your thoughts, the activities of your mind, your feelings, emotions, sense that we might talk about a heart way of knowledge, and sensations, our bodily sensations, what you can see and touch and smell. Where do you get most trust out of the way you think, the way you feel, or what you can feel bodily and sensorily? And in your way of knowing, do you admit to knowledges that go into a more, an area that is less easy to define? For you, is some kind of spiritual knowledge and experience important, and an important kind of knowing? And are these ways of knowing things that you judge about others? Do you judge people who are better at knowing through sensation and doing? Do you think that emotions are untrustworthy? Do you think thinking is the way forward? Do you accept or reject the fact that people might include a spiritual awareness in their way of knowing? Do these kinds of ideas challenge you to think, is your understanding of knowledge inclusive, or is it quite exclusive? How do you think about knowing and what you know? Here's another question. There are ways of knowing from experience, but experience also offers you different domains of knowing. You can have personal experience. I might know some rivers because I've worked in them, swum in them, collected bugs out of them. They're close to me, they're part of what I know. Then there's practical and positional experience out of your job that you do. So the personal experience of a river, in my case, or in aquatic systems, is added to by the fact that my position as the director of a research institute in water, I have a kind of set of knowledges around my position. And then there's the question of professional and qualifications. So for me, I have qualifications up to an academic level of a PhD. Does that make a difference in the trustworthiness of my knowledge? How do you trust experience? Do you trust personal experience, whether somebody has a particular position and what their qualifications are? All of these things affect the way we experience other people and their ways of knowing. I was introduced to the idea of epistemic justice or epistemic injustice by a student of mine whom I co-supervised with Charlie Pafitis, who was trained in our philosophy department. And there are three areas of training that I wish I had access to a deepened training. One is philosophy, and the other two are economics and geology, because I would just love to understand some of the landscapes from a geological point of view. And economics is just another dimension of the kind of complex systems that ecosystems are. So there are always knowledge horizons to push. I think we all have a sense of some things we just wish we knew a tiny bit more about. Let's go back to epistemic justice and injustice. There are ways in which knowledge is used that is either fair or unfair, inclusive or exclusive. And two of the words that describe this are testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. So epistemic injustice means justice in relation to what and how you know. When we talk about testimonial injustice, we're talking about the way you know, the expression of what you know, your position as a knower is demeaned or excluded because of categorizations, social testimonies of who you are. And there can be race, gender, age, disability, economic status. You will all have experienced some aspect of who you are, meaning that you were more or less visible or heard in a particular context. And nobody who's grown up or spends any time in South Africa or across Africa can say they have never been aware of exclusions because of belonging to a particular category. Then there's the hermeneutics of injustice. And I see I left a spelling mistake there. Sorry about that. And this is much more to do with exclusions because of what and how and the way you know. So you can come into a space and your degree of literacy, your level of education, your training may mean you're not part of the conversation because the conversation itself is exclusive. The vocabulary, we talk about jargon. I mean, I could leap into ecological terms that some of you may be familiar with and some of you may not be. There are also exclusions of social comfort. You can move into a place and be exclusive by the familiarity and way in which you speak to somebody else, knowing that other people in that space will not feel quite as comfortable as you do. And then there's the question of language and translation. So if you're a first, second, or third language speaker, hermeneutic exclusion, hermeneutic injustice can come through simply not understanding the language. And the photograph that I have on the slide is the very first meeting I had in a village in the Tsitsa catchment up near Maclear in the highland grasslands of what used to be the Transkei. And at that stage of my work in rural communities, I felt quite comfortable speaking in English and allowing space for translation. It wasn't until 3 years later, maybe even 4 years later, after a process that I'll share with you in a minute, where we began not to translate from English into isiXhosa, but to run engagements in isiXhosa and provide translation into English, that I had any concept of what the language you speak meant in terms of hermeneutic injustice. I was so used to being the one who spoke and understood what was being said and being polite through translation, that to sit for a day listening and not understanding probably 90% of it, listening to a whispered translation in my ear, trying to make sense of what was going on with this limited level of input, gave me a first-hand experience of that has left me both deeply respectful of translations and deeply aware of the limitations of it. And so the way in which you work and the way in which you are is affected by your knowledge of ways in which knowledge can be exclusive and unjust. Okay, I'm going to jump to the left a little bit, and those were challenges about the way in which you know about knowledge. Now I'm going to ask you a question about what is real, because knowledge very often is assumed to be about knowing about what is. And I go back to my first slide where there are boundaries to what we actually know is and is not. I mean, I got trained as an empirical science ecologist where there were things you can measure. You can't measure a sense of humor. And there are dimensions way beyond that we're not sure of, but we can sense we've experienced. And what is interesting to me is that there are 3 theoretical frameworks out there that have a very similar sense of a laminated model of what is real. And all of them acknowledge that it's fairly easy to say that we know that the physics and chemistry of the earth is real. Now, the 3 ways, these 3 theories are critical realism in red with Roy Pascal, transdisciplinarity, which you will deal with a little bit more, and then integral theory, which is Ken Wilber's thinking. But if you have a look at the commonalities here, they all say that at the foundational level, there's a chemistry, there's the physical being. In terms of transdisciplinarity, there's the whole thing of working out what is the isness of the world. I mean, this as far as we know is a pencil. Then we get on top of that, you can't do without the what is, but then you get the whole phenomenon of biology. And in transdisciplinarity, there's the question of what are we able to do, and the body and biology. Building on that, you have ecology and social systems, you have psychology, and up to the spiritual and creative. So all of these systems go from a very fundamental recognition of the substance of the world all the way through to dimensions that are less easy to define in terms of tying down reality. I'm going to come back to the transdisciplinary hierarchy because it's a tiny bit different, but both critical realism and integral theory go all the way from cells and chemistry up to society and beyond. So here you have this idea that the ways of knowing and knowledge can be built on, and that some ways of knowing are dependent on other ways of knowing, and that some elements of what you know depend on others. So if you want to be a biologist, you have to know something about chemistry and physics because that's the makeup of the biological world. So that was quite a brief flavor and challenge around the things that could push you a little bit in asking the question, what is knowledge? And what I'm going to do for the last bit of this is to share a little bit with you about what we're doing around our exploration of knowing and how we've put some of these questions into practice. So what you have here is a photograph of the senior researchers across the Arua Water Center of Excellence. And these folk came all the way from Nigeria, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Senegal, Ethiopia, to Makanda to work with us on how we were going to run a project together right across Africa that was going to do 2 things. It was going to address some difficult water-related problems, but it was also going to challenge the way in which research is used in development. Because we wanted to say 3-year research projects that land in a problem situation, do some work and disappear, don't actually leave a legacy of knowledge behind them in the way that might be possible. And so we were quite ambitious. We decided we would be focused around SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is around water. Some of the countries wanted to look at pollution. Some countries wanted to look at quantity of water and the way in which they were shared across large farmers and small farmers. Generally, we were asking who benefits? Who benefits from the way water is used? When you're talking about pollution, you're often asking, what are the disbenefits? Who are affected by pollution? And then supporting that, we were going to ask questions about participatory governance. Governance is the way things are governed or arranged. And in societies where inequity or social justice is low, very often governance might be weak, And power relations mean that if you are in one of those epistemic injustice groups, you are less likely to experience benefits from using your resources. And so if you think of all the things I've talked about in terms of knowledge, and you try and package them into a way of doing research, we've called that package the adaptive systemic approach. There's heaps and heaps of literature. There's lots of complexity around it. So again, I'm going to just give you a flavor of what that might mean. Whenever you do or undertake research that involves people in relationship with each other or in relationship with the natural world, because of the complexity of people, society, and the world, it's important to put a dotted line around your study and say what is right in the middle of your research question and what just influences it. And that's what we call the step bound, knowing what you're working on and what you're not. When you're working in a way that says we want to develop knowledge over broad systems, when you want to develop knowledge in partnerships, where the question or the problem you're trying to address has so many elements and so many people involved that you need to share knowledge across a broad way of knowing, and you want to be able to do that fairly. And so we undertake something called an adaptive planning process. And that is a methodology that is designed to reduce epistemic injustice, to increase the likelihood of a sense and experience of respect, to draw people in so that they share the knowledge they have freely and enthusiastically, and that we grow knowledge about a question richly. We then say there is a formal area in which we undertake very specific research to gather more information around a particular question. There is a role for that formal disciplinary excellence that says, if I want to know about how this river, about the organisms that live in this river, I've got to go and sample them, and I need to know about the ways in which you do that so that you have good, reliable data. But once you have this mix of knowledge of what people know and the research you've done, either social science research or science research, but you've actually gathered some new data, new information, new insights into the question, then in the work we do, there's always the question of, so what are you going to do with it? What system is the knowledge needed for? Where is it applied? And what we do, because we're in the business of looking at the way in which people relate to natural resources, we alert stakeholders and partners to this idea of strategic adaptive management, because it's a way of managing that increases listening and learning. It allows you to do what you inevitably do, which is to fail. You do not get it right all the time. And most of our learning happens when things go wrong. And so strategic adaptive management is again something that we've learned how to do, and we help with training people. We also engage with people around this idea of participatory governance. That if you want to manage something in a way that means you are less likely to get power imbalances and domination of some groups over others, is if you encourage a participatory space where you've equaled out some of those power imbalances. And so we work towards what we call participatory governance, working together to make decisions. And as you work through these different stages, you also say that if you want to learn, if you want to learn what you've done right and learn what you've done wrong and shift how you do it in the future, you've got to monitor what you're doing. You've got to evaluate and reflect and learn about it. And it is best done in a participatory way. And so this particular method encourages us to think of knowledge in an extremely broad, rich, inclusive, egalitarian, and fair way. So what we've done is to put into the question, what is knowledge, a whole lot of norms and ethics around what we want knowledge to be. Because knowledge isn't a thing, it's quite slippery, and the way in which we engage with it is very diverse and depends on, or perhaps I think really does need, some kind of articulated value system. Because if we don't articulate the value system and aren't careful with knowledge, it becomes something, or it can become something we don't want, something that is exclusive and unfair. So I'm going to just amplify on those ideas a little bit. I don't think you're going to need very much of this. And I'm just watching the time. So these are some ideas in case you're interested in that system of the adaptive systemic approach. Why would you want to bound it? Why would you want to know what you were looking at and what you weren't looking at? And it's because things like time and space and relationships and questions can blow out of all proportion, and you can get lost down little rabbit holes. So scoping the scale of where you want to work is helpful. And there's a range of theories that will support the fact that it's quite easy to get lost in the bigness of questions and not be able to hang on to what it is you're trying to find out about. Then there's this whole question of complex systems. Most of the difficult questions that face humanity today, things like social justice, human trafficking, ecological decline, climate change, air pollution, all of these things are really difficult to solve, and one single action won't solve them. And this is because they are inherently complex systems. And if you're interested in complex systems, there's a whole lot of work around them. But the fact of, once you understand a little bit of how complex systems work, then you understand why you need different ways of knowledge, different forms of knowledge to shift problems in a particular direction. So these complex systems have many different elements, many different parts. The processes aren't linear. They don't just go as you take, that 1 degree Celsius will change by 1 meter squared every time. They're non-linear. They travel in different directions, and we're not quite sure what the process will look like. Scale matters. Feedback happens. As one thing happens, it triggers something else. The context of the work becomes incredibly important. And so if you're going to work academically or practically in a situation, some understanding of the complexity and contextual nature of where you're working becomes really important. This is one of my favorite spaces. Anyone here who knows me at all will know that I'm deeply committed to this idea of transdisciplinarity. And the reason is because I don't think we can do important work with only one way of knowing. I think we have to draw on the absolute richest form of knowledge. All of those questions I asked you in the beginning, to draw information about the people who are usually excluded, the ages, the different dimensions, the fact that people don't always talk about their emotions, that they discount their personal experiences, that they're worried to admit certain ways of understanding the world. All of that becomes accepted as valuable ways of knowing in a transdisciplinary way of working. And inevitably, then you also accept all the different kinds of disciplines. More than that, you're saying that when you're in the business of knowledge creation and knowledge making in something like research, You undertake it together. You undertake it with society and for society. You're engaging in asking questions that affect people, and therefore you're engaging with them. And we have tips and principles for how building transdisciplinary teams that work well are effective. It's always useful to have young and older voices. Young and older voices bring different kinds of ways of knowing. It's important to learn by doing. You can't do all of your learning just at a screen or in a book. It's important to share what you know as a specialist and to listen to other people so that you can start to build the puzzle of the different ways in which different knowledges fit together. And then there are all sorts of ways in which working with people help. It's important to tolerate being uncomfortable. Tolerate it when you feel excluded or exposed or bored. And say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, have a look at whether there's something you could learn. Be sensitive to aha moments. You know that time when you think, yes, I recognize that. Engage generously, listen and share. Be tolerant. Be sensitive to arrivals. Things happen, they come in. Be sensitive and willing to allow that. Create and use chances to be reflexive. We all need a bit of quiet and mulling over and thinking. If you're trying to organize to learn in a social way among people, you will have to learn tolerance and managing discontinuities. Discontinuities are all the things that go wrong. When you're trying to work with a group of people over time and only half the people arrive, when dates change, when travel plans go awry, when this hall you've booked is being used for something else. The myriad of things that make engaging with people difficult. You just have to roll with them. As they happen, you say, okay, here we go. Here's my newest discontinuity. How am I going to adapt to it? And because that's quite hard, there's this idea of sustaining inquiry, of persevering and keeping going. And remembering that everybody who's involved in your research or your learning or your growing knowledge is a whole person with many ways of being and knowing. If you invite people into your space, you can, by the way you invite it, only invite certain parts of them and only accept certain parts of the way they know. And there are ways of being more generous and inviting people as whole people and accepting a rich way of knowing. I think that I've been wildly optimistic about what I might do this afternoon. And so I'm going to stop here and have questions. And then if there's anything else you want to explore, let's see how we go after that. Thanks. Sure, let's see if there are any questions up to that idea of rich knowledge sharing.
Does anybody have a question? Would you like to put up your hand and ask, or type it in the chats, or just unmute your microphone and introduce yourself? Oh, Mariette says, just a comment. This is amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Mariette.
Okay, so are you happy for me? I'm going to push a little bit about some questions in a minute, but let's carry on for the moment. If there's nothing you'd like to, oh, we have until 4:30.
Yes, we do have time.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought we were finishing at 4, and I was suddenly thinking, why am I wittering on for such a long time?
No. Go for it. Witter on. This is fascinating. Really enjoying it.
Okay, cool. Let's go back and see where we're up to. Okay, so I think maybe I got a bit nervous about this slide, even though it's one of my favorite bits of ways of knowing. I thought, oh my goodness, how are we going to get into this in the time we have? But this is Max Neef's 2005 idea of transdisciplinarity. And that's quite a long time ago. I can remember when a colleague of mine sent me this paper, being both bemused by it and excited by the ideas, and the whole scholarship of transdisciplinarity has grown so much since then. But I have always found it quite a useful way of seeing how our formal disciplinary ways of knowing could link with each other. And so Max Neef suggests that we can think about what exists, that kind of baseline of those laminated systems of what is real. And things like maths, anthropology, economics, ecology, zoology, the basic things that say, let's go out and understand and measure, help us to have data about what's out there, what exists. It's the empirical knowledge. And then you say, well, what do we do with this? What does it allow? What does our knowledge and measurement and understanding allow us to do? So there's a pragmatic and action knowledge that take us into areas like policy and risk analysis, game theory, engineering, agriculture, education. All of these kinds of things start to use knowledge in doing. Now, there is cartloads that we know how to do, that we're capable of doing. And so when we are faced with a particular problem, we're faced with so which bits of knowledge am I going to use? What am I going to choose to take account of? And here we use things like adaptive management, planning, design, politics, law, to select which bits of knowledge we need. But finally, there's the question of what do we actually do? And what you actually do, from whether you've come to this webinar or whether you brushed your teeth this morning or the way you plan and do your research, comes down to your values and your ethics. All of your decisions around how you act are driven by the values that you have, and you always act out of your values. And so that tells you something about the way in which knowledge is both built and used. I found it so affirming to realize that values, which have always been important to me, weren't just fuzzy. They weren't just fluffy things you popped on the wall. You know, the values of this organization are. That your values are actually evident perfectly simply by the way you behave. And that includes all of the dimensions of your life, including research. And so that puts value systems right into the fundamentals of the way in which we deal with knowledge. The other really fun thing was, I always, you know, you only have to do a little bit of biology to know that most young animals learn by playing. And actually, we're no different. I put in a big grant proposal once that in its title had playground, because I wanted to indicate that we were being innovative and new and that we were searching. And the project was funded, but we were told we had to change the title. There was no room in serious work for playgrounds. But actually, the way you explore, the way you change what you're doing, grows the way you understand things. And Ray Eison's picture I've always found really interesting, where the history of the situation, which is part of the context, and I talked to you a little bit about how context frames the complex systems we work in. So you take account of the history, and then you start to change and do something. And as you do that, so your understanding increases. And this cycling between doing and learning is the material of transformation. Transformation is learning by the way we do and the way we understand, and moving in the direction we would like to go to, towards some sort of concerted action towards something new. And transformation is a word we're all familiar with, and I find this a really helpful way of understanding or knowing about, playing with the notion of transformation. It is really easy to get overwhelmed. It's really, really easy to get, oh my goodness, this is all too much. I'm out of here. I can't read another book. I can't read another paper. I can't gather another bit of data. I can't go into another participatory process. It is all just too much. And it's really important then to understand that that sense of too much is real, because there's a point at which simplicity gives you your best chance of acting effectively. So let's have a look at this idea of requisite simplicity. And requisite simplicity means as much complexity as you need and no more. As much detail and interaction as you need to make a real, to do what you want to do, but not adding more. When you're attacking, when you're building, and building knowledge very often means more detail. Start off, and as you add detail in knowing, so it's more useful. And this increased detailed knowledge becomes more and more useful. And then there's a point at which, as you add more detail, it gets overcomplicated and it's not as useful as it could be. But then, as you're adding more detail, somebody says here, I'll come into the real world, you don't need all this information. And so you cut down on the detail because it was too expensive or too difficult or too much of a hassle. And if you oversimplify, you go backwards and it's not as useful as it might be. And then you need to recognize and start adding some more detail. But you end up in this zone here, number 2, where you're saying, I've got as much as I need to take this forward. It doesn't mean you're closed to new interesting things, but it just warns you not to keep overcomplicating things. Now, when you're writing a thesis, this is a really useful point to get to register. This is what I need to do in order to get on and write this piece of work. I don't need to read another 25 papers and clutter up my head. So keeping this idea of how much you need and not overdoing it, difficult balance, but it's worth knowing about. I think that's in the wrong place. So once we've gone through the bound process, we get into this facilitated adaptive planning process. Now, any of you who work with people and those people are needing to manage or to engage with their world, this is a really, really useful process for inclusively gathering rich knowledge. There's a very nice handbook on how to do this. It's the baseline of what we call strategic adaptive management. But basically here we get researchers together developing a vision for what it is out of this particular knowledge building exercise you want, so that you know where you want to go to. And then you explore the values that you have, because that tells you how you want to go there. And then you start exploring with everybody the knowledge that you have about your system: social, technical, economic, ecological, political knowledge. VSTEEP just gives you an acronym to remind you to take account of values and to explore your context richly. In these kinds of systems, the way you facilitate matters. The way in which you elicit information from people, so that we have ways of eliciting that say you, for example, let me just give you a quick example. If we were all sitting around in a room instead of on Zoom, and please maybe one day be back in a room, because I just thrive on real people in real places, and I find the screen okay, but not as nice. If you were, all of you, from, let's say, a village or a university or a business, there would inevitably be among you people at different ranks. You know, if in this situation you would have me with the rank of professor, and I saw among you some students, and you might think that I would have a different specialness of knowledge. And if you were in a place where you expected more senior people to be asked first or to speak longer, it often happens in traditional settings where you would expect more senior people, and often particularly men, to be given a greater space to speak. And so what we do in these facilitations is we ask everyone to write down their top 3 ideas or their top 3 notions. And then we randomly go around the room collecting one at a time. And you write it down on a board so that everybody sees in front of everybody else that you have collected their particular piece of knowledge or idea. And you randomly go around until you have elicited as much as you can from everyone. And because you've gone around in a random order, nobody's knowledge has been privileged. People who are shy have only been asked to contribute one small thing in the same way as everyone else. And people who are expansive have also only been asked to share one small piece. And generally that way of gathering among a group helps this idea of epistemic justice, of people's ways of knowing being treated fairly. I'm not going to go into the rest of an adaptive planning process. It's just one of the tools that there are for taking account of the richness of knowledge and of gathering it as fairly as possible. This is the part of the adaptive systemic approach where we say, when you go into a project, there's very often a piece of work to be done to gather some new information. And you do not escape academic rigor just because you include wide range of knowledge. When you have a particular piece of work to do, you are constrained by the absolutely best of that discipline. So up here, you've got a photograph of my very dear husband, Tony, who works on how much water is used by plants across landscapes. And this is one of these complicated bits of equipment. Now, it's terribly important how you set that equipment up. All of the things that you make sure of to make sure that your data are understood and rigorously gathered. Down here, you've got what I used to spend a lot of time sitting collecting bugs in a river to either do ecotox experiments or to understand ecology. Then there are those of you who go out and do interviews and gather data from people. In every case, there is a proper methodology, an excellent way of collecting information, an important way of reading the literature and understanding logic and presenting your ideas. So I don't want you to think that what is knowledge is endlessly, it's inclusive, but it's not an escape from doing it really well. And so when you're in the business of doing your research in a particular question, you are constrained by the methods that mean you get the best quality of data you can. When you want to work in a transdisciplinary way, you have to decide whether this is the way in which you want to work, because there are what we call transaction costs. The cost, it is in many ways easier and quicker and crisper to go out into the field and collect data on evapotranspiration of plants through using a piece of equipment than it is to do that in relation to all of the villagers who live around this area and ask them the value of ecosystem services related to those plants. So when you want to start introducing different elements of a complex system and different kinds of knowledges together, it takes longer to produce a knowledge outcome. For me, it's been worth learning how to do it because it's meant I can do the kind of research and play in some of the difficult questions that I've wanted to, but not everybody wants to. And excellent research in very focused disciplinary areas is extremely valuable, and the knowledge that is generated can be put into very valuable places. So the way I'm talking about knowledge in terms of this adaptive systemic approach is only one of the ways of playing with knowledge in higher education and research and academia. If you do want to work with people and across contexts, just the work that I've done over the last decade or so, my key messages are no one can go it alone. This is not stuff you can do on your own. Partnerships are essential. And your own personal attributes, being willing to trust and being trustworthy, elements of humility because none of us can possibly know everything, and possibly above everything, courage, because often we feel insecure. Many things go wrong. Not everybody outside trusts that this way of building knowledge is valuable and rigorous enough. So you need to be brave. And then flexibility and connectedness. Being able to, and I think this works for any kind of knowledge gathering, not being too rigid, being able to open up and read and see how something connects in, being open to that idea that might blow some of your other ideas out the water. And then connectedness helps us be part of communities of practice and helps us become more confident in the way we think and the way we practice. I've gone on now to the third part of the ASA, and I think by now I, and possibly you, have got a bit lost about what we're doing. So I'm going to go back and just remind us. Right here, I introduced you to the fact that this group of people across Africa were all working together to look at some really difficult water-related problems. And that what we have done is to package a way of gathering knowledge and using it in a way that we hope is inclusive and leads to what we hope will be both, we call it social-ecological justice, that will increase fairness to people and to the way in which people use the environment. And this approach has 4 steps. I've talked to you about bound, about how you need to know what is in and out of your question. I've talked to you about an adaptive planning process which helps you work with the group of people who are experiencing the problem so that they get to make input into the vision of where you want to go to and how you can plan to use knowledge in solving it. We've talked a little bit about the research that you have to do and the fact that the research you do, whatever it is in the many ways of gathering knowledge, has to be rigorous and proper. And I think I had just got to 3B, which was alert stakeholders to the practice of strategic adaptive management. Or I think actually I had got to participatory governance. So these B and C are pretty interchangeable. Adaptive management means the people who are responsible for managing a problem actually learn how to do it in a way that listens and is responsive. And participatory governance, again, is the structures of decision-making and how you include people. So I'm going to go back now to this participatory governance story that I had got to. Here we go. Participatory governance development. Now, every project comes to an end. You will be glad to know, if you're students, that your research project for your degree will come to an end. You will finish it off, write it up, and get the degree. But what does it leave behind? For those of us who write project proposals to answer questions with real people and real problems, we generally get funded for at most 3 years. Generally, the kinds of problems we're working on are much bigger than 3 years worth of work, or even 5 years of work, or even 10 years of work. And if we go into work, particularly with communities who may be, have less access to wealth and opportunity I'm not quite sure how to put this, but if you imagine many possibly rural communities or communities who are living in informal settlements, if you go in to address a problem, you can very easily overpromise because you're not actually able to deliver something in the time frame that you have. So you've got to be very careful about bounding what you do indicate you're going to be involved in. But what is the legacy that you can leave that is likely to survive beyond your research, your way of gathering knowledge? I think part of it is if you can knit those people who experience a kind of problem with those people who make decisions about the problem. So generally, there are a group of people in power, government sometimes, and they have governance systems on how to manage. And very often those systems do not include the people who experience the problem. And so what we try and do is when we engage with people, we try to learn about the formal governance system, and we try and facilitate processes that bring local people, whomever they might be, into contact with decision makers and build bridges between them. There are many labels for this. Stakeholder empowerment is one of them. These are pictures of the Tsitsa River catchment up there near Maclear, beautiful highland grasslands, and these are ways in which we were trying to work with people so that they became engaged with and connected with people who are making decisions about landscapes. And this gives you a little bit of a flavor of something called polycentric governance. Well, it's basically the fact that the idea that decisions are made in different places by different people. So there's formal government, and in South Africa, we've got national, provincial, local, and local can be district and local municipalities. You have traditional government. We have places where there are traditional leaders and traditional councils and village-based decision-making, and they might intersect in area with some of the formal governance systems. And then you've got this wild card of getting people involved, and in all of it, power matters. Who is influencing the way decisions are made? And so what we've done is we have developed what we call a capability pathway, a theory of change, a way in which local people can become accustomed to and engaged in and exposed to formal decision-making. And going back to epistemic justice and to the title of this afternoon's thinking, it starts with co-knowing. It starts with who knows what, in what way, in the way that is respected. Do we have the same vocabulary and understanding and language and way of talking? How is it that we can level the playing field of knowledge? Can we use that to encourage listening and speaking to each other? Will that build the trust necessary to plan together? Can there be influence in decision making that is more inclusive? And so this notion of growing the space of knowledge in action or knowledge in decision making and government becomes something about the justice of knowing and what you know and how you know. And we all know the question of who you know. I'm not going to talk about these this afternoon, but there are things that are accessible to you. Strategic adaptive management is the big context in which you do that adaptive planning, and we've got a very nice little booklet that explains it quite easily. And the notion of PMO, participatory monitoring, evaluation, reflection, and learning, just reminds you that if you want to keep track of what you're learning, you have to find a way of monitoring it and basically keeping track of it. That none of us can digest a large amount of knowledge without reflection. And so when you are encouraged by people to think about things, to spend time journaling, to explore your own feelings, that's an important part of learning and monitoring and evaluating how you're doing and how your research process is going. Right, so when I had a bit of a panic at 20 to 4, this was exactly where I wanted to get to with half an hour to spare. So there we go. There's something about the grey hair and memory that speaks a lot. So I'm going to go back to these questions that Sharon kindly sent me as a spur to thinking about this afternoon. And I want to think about how we expand our notions of these concepts. And we're going to have a go at you experiencing what I talked about, which was a kind of way in which we can see if we gather some knowledge together here and learn from each other in a way that is exclusive. In a way that is inclusive, in a way that is invitational and doesn't make you feel, oh goodness, I don't want to say anything. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at one of these questions. Each of you have a bit of paper next to you. Whose knowledge is valued and why? Do you have an idea about that? Whose knowledge do you think is valued? Have you ever seen a particular kind of knowledge being valued more than others? Or you could think about, what is the knowledge that you create? Where have you managed to actually grow an understanding of something? Where has one of your ideas come to you and thought, oh goodness, that's something new and interesting? Or what do you think it means to make a contribution to growing knowledge? Do you think you have to write a book? Or do you think you might just be able to share an idea in a group discussion? How do you learn confidence about growing the way in which you want to share that? What about knowledge that is generated by participants? What do you think about that? Do you have an idea about fake news and lies? Is there anything new and interesting that you learned today? Were any of these ideas new to you? Do you want to make any comment about those ways of knowing? Sensation, thinking, feeling, position, personal experience, and professional. I want you to think about something that you could add into this, expanding our notions of these concepts. And I'm going to ask you to share them. So I'm going to say thank you. And thank you always to the lovely Tammy who contributed the diagrams that we use in a lot of our work. And let's see if we can have a rich discussion. And now I see there is already something in the chat. Right, so what Sharon has suggested is type your thoughts in the chat and we can have a discussion. And Sharon, is this yours? I'm exploring new methods in my own research, participatory methods, so that I can learn. Is that yours?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to take it a tiny bit forward, and let's just spend, how many people have we got? We've got 23 people and we've got 20 minutes. Let's just see if we could collect one idea. You're very welcome to write in the chat. And if I ask you to share an idea and you'd rather just write in the chat, that's absolutely fine. But let's see if we can hear some of the voices, just to get a little flavor of us all being in the room. And if you'd like to put your video on when you're talking, you're very welcome. And I'm going to start with somebody I know and whom I know is really brave. So Nelson, could you kick us off with an idea in this kind of area of what is knowledge? Something you think you can add into this discussion?
Charlie, you caught me unaware.
That's okay.
Oh, God.
Is that too difficult?
Let me collect my thoughts.
Let you collect your thoughts. That's fine. We'll come back to you.
Please, thanks.
Okay. I'm going to start with people I know just to give you all a little bit of a chance to collect your thoughts. And the next person I'm going to ask is Matuboho, because it was Matuboho who taught me about epistemic justice. So Matuboho, in terms of all those questions we've raised, have you got an idea about knowledge you think is interesting or you'd like to share?
Hi, everyone. Nelson, I think we should be used to Tali by now. I mean, as I was looking at the questions, what actually happened was that I got to realize that one of the projects that I was working in, the TSF, as you know it, what I got out of that was that it was actually speaking to the kind of research that I'm doing right now, where I just realized that, in a way, as we're asking people to reflect with us about the experiences of learning during the COVID-19, where we're trying to now co-create and continue the cycle, the capability pathway that you just spoke about, where we realized that so the face-to-face notion, where COVID now has forced us to work remotely, has removed some aspect of relationality in a way where people now feel like their learning or their ability to participate in spaces has been sort of like constrained in a way, especially people who are not very confident technological wise, and especially in these are contexts where there is we have this network issues. And so as you were speaking now, I was in my head, what just arose was just the fact that I'm wondering how much more people can take in terms of being constrained by this notion of network and technological constraints in terms of working now during this uncertain times. So for me now, the knowledge, how are we going to now try and incorporate those people's knowledges into the mainstream, especially those people who are afraid to raise their hand during a platform like this. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that just came out of me as you were speaking, and yeah.
Thanks, Matuboho. That's really thoughtful. I'd like to move between people and the chat. So I'm going to ask Sharon just to explain to share what she had put in the chat.
Oh, okay. Essentially, my new research is looking at things that are very hard to measure, like people's emotional responses to, I'm particularly interested in doctoral supervision, and I'm particularly interested in questions around who gets to belong to the academy and how is belonging communicated and understood and experienced by students. And I often think that, especially when we do research with people who are relatively less powerful than we are, and when we sort of come at it from a very deductive way of working, so I have a theoretical framework and I'm going to do interviews and collect data, and then I'm going to apply my theory to the data, and then I'm going to say what I think is happening. I've been thinking a lot over the last couple of years about what does that really mean for my participants? What do they get out of that? Am I really actually enabling them to help me create that knowledge? You know, am I kind of going in there with ideas about what things are and then missing things because I'm not actually enabling them to really, and also, you know, share their work in ways that words can't always capture. So I've used some participatory action research, which is lots of visual methods, in some of my training. And I found that much richer stories came out of that. And there was much more of a sense of a co-creation of the space. It wasn't me kind of saying, this is what I need from you. It was them saying, this is what I can offer you, which is, it sounds like it's a very small change, but for me, it feels quite profound. And I think that it's potentially then a way of listening very differently to what people have to offer in terms of understanding the world differently, rather than what am I trying to extract from them for my own purposes. It's more about, can I offer you something as you offer me something, and can we have a mutual exchange? So
glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's early days, but I'm quite excited about it. And this was very, very helpful as well for also just thinking about, I liked your notion of I can't remember what you called it, but that simplicity, like how much do you need without making this so complicated that you're going to go down all sorts of rabbit holes that are just going to hurt your brain.
Barnesh
had a comment. I don't know if Barnesh is connected to the audio, but Barnesh says, moving from knowledge to action, especially when it comes to behavior change, he doesn't have a mic, sorry, seems very difficult. How you convince people that they should make a change. And he asks, what are your suggestions, especially for working in teams, if you have any? So how, you know, you go from this process of creating all this knowledge, but then people have to start changing their behaviors. That figure into the knowledge creation.
That's
process.
interesting. I suppose what we hope is that if you co-create the vision of where you want to go to, so if when you're engaging in a team and you collect together that you want to go somewhere and that involves change, and you collectively move or agree or work out how that change can happen. Again, exploring values so that if you start to articulate what value you really have deeply and then how that can be expressed in behavior. I don't think it's ever easy. Over and over again, behavior change is the point that is the sticking point. I only have to look at how long it took me to absolutely never use a plastic bag in a shop. And even now, I cave sometimes. Behavior change is hard. So I'll draw on when we've had a look at some of the others. Barnesh will get back and see, or perhaps somebody else has got a comment to add to that in terms of eliciting behavior change out of knowledge. Anybody else want to comment on that? Just checking for hands. Let's see if somebody comes to that. Nelson, are you coming back in? Thank you.
Yes. So, Sally, thank you so much. You know, a few days ago, I was invited to give a talk on how TD could contribute to the reconfiguring of African studies. And one of my argument was that when we walk into a space, we mustn't assume that the space is deficit of knowledge.
Mm.
You know, that the space we are walking into and the people we are engaging with have knowledge about the very issue that we want to actually explore. So that would then imply that knowledge in itself manifests in different forms and come from multiple sources. And therefore, we as academics, how do we value such knowledge? In fact, before we even talk about valuing that knowledge, do we even recognize it? You know, so, and then this links back to the notion of epistemic justice. Then I use the term epistemic parity, you know, the notion of one recognizing the diversity of knowledge systems and sources of knowledge, and also upholding the notion that all knowledge are valued at the beginning or less otherwise proven, right? And then that would mean having an open mindset about what knowledge is and what knowledge is not. You know, so that is some of the reflection that I had in that conversation, which I think is also germane here, you know, because we're talking to researchers that engage with communities, and most of the time we think that we actually know better than the people we're engaging with. If we know better, why do we engage?
Yeah, the humility story. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Thanks,
You know,
Nelson. Thank you. I'm going to do, so Banesh noticed that makes the point that there's more than one approach and things take time. And I write about things taking time quite a lot. I really agree with you there. So let's have a go at saying, Nontutuzelo, do you feel you could add something for us? Are you comfortable?
Thank you, Doc. My voice is out. I don't have a voice.
Oh, shame. I'm sorry.
I have a flu.
Oh,
Thank you
that's
very much for
nice.
the information. Otherwise, I'm not myself at all.
That's okay. We wish you well and hope you feel better.
Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for not feeling I'm
straining
putting
me.
you too much on the spot.
If I'm talking, it's straining a lot.
Okay, that's
Thank you
fine.
very much.
Let's try Thomas. Thomas Salmon. Okay, I'm looking for extra chats and people that I can call on. What about Neith? Neith Moore? Growing our understanding of knowledge, expanding these ideas. Was there anything that took your fancy?
Hi.
Hi.
Can I just paste into the comment, because I've been writing as I've been listening, and I'm afraid it's like almost developed into a little essay all on its own as I was trying to formulate my question about what kind of knowledge do I create, because I'm thinking that's a bit fringe. I think that's, to put it mildly, with Barad and Jane Bennett and vital materials and vital matter, where I'm not working with people at all. And it's really difficult to give materials agency. I was just listening to what you were saying about working with, how does water speak? I mean, how do you ask questions of water? So this is where I'm going. And I sometimes feel a little schizophrenic, to put it mildly. I have to unlearn everything about anthropocentrism. It's really difficult. And I just, in terms of any kind of system to adapt as a human being within that system where materials are as equal as I am is quite difficult. And I don't know if it has any input in terms of giving me a bit more courage. As you said, it's hard.
I think that's wonderful, because as you speak, you turn my head upside down, which is exactly what knowledge is. I mean, I spoke for ages about giving voice to the voiceless when we were writing a new water law in South Africa. And then you say, but you have to let go of being anthropocentric. So I think what you've raised is enormously challenging. So yeah, I think that's exactly what knowledge creation is about. I'm deeply curious and I want to learn more. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Do paste it into the chat. We'd love to keep it and for people to learn. Thank you so much.
I have pasted it into the chat. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Thank you
so much. Okay. Any voluntary contributions before I do my extra random asking? I'm coming to, let's have a look who else is here. Ida Mbengo. Any ideas you'd like to share with us?
Hi, Prof. Unfortunately, I joined about 30 minutes late, and I didn't get the gist of everything. All right, I'm working in an area where I'm trying to explore agency, small-scale farmers agency. And the idea of creating new knowledge comes in it, because the concept I'm working with is climate smart agriculture, which has been proposed as a way out for African smallholder farmers. But from literature, from what is happening, it's not being taken up by the African community, the smallholder farmers. So what I'm trying to do is to create knowledge on what is the African context, which makes it not work. If you look at, say, South America, it has worked. Canada, and in the Western world, it has worked. But when it comes now to Africa, what are the issues? So it's actually a challenge for me to create the new knowledge. I'm trying to use critical realism to achieve that. And hopefully I'll be able to. I've just started to get into the field and collect data. So I learned something, but I'm hoping that when I go through this recording, I'll be able now to clarify my way forward. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, Ida. I think that making your way through agency and using what I find critical realism a challenging lens to use. It's a brave and it's a very rich way of understanding. So Sharon, I'm going to hand back to you now. We've got 3 more minutes. I don't know if you want to make any closing remarks, but I want to say thank you to everybody who was brave and wrote into the chat and allowed me to ask you questions. So thank you all very much indeed. Sharon?
Thanks, Telly. All that remains really is for us to say thank you so much for making time to be here with us this afternoon and for this really provocative and also very practical and useful session. It's really ended our semester on a high note. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for all of you for being here. Please join us next semester for more of these kinds of seminars starting in July. Keep an eye on the list and we'll be sending around details of that as soon as possible. But in the meantime, stay warm and stay safe. and we'll see you all again in a seminar or a short course soon. And when it gets there, enjoy the weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Cheers.